Thanks everyone very much for being here. I'm not going to talk long, but just to briefly introduce the three panelists, and then each of them will speak for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for Q&A and discussion. Feel free to pop questions in the chat, or we can do, oh good, we're recording. Okay, sorry. That was like my one job, was to make sure that we're recording, but I think it looks like somebody else is. Okay. And then, yeah, so hopefully we can have a fruitful discussion. But I want to introduce our three great panelists. Unfortunately, we had asked Jen Pace to be a part of this. She's done some really great mixed methods and qualitative work in this area. Unfortunately, you know, she's dealing with all kinds of stuff in Texas. And in addition to like her own situation, you know, she's trying to help her students. And so I told her that we know that it's not due to lack of enthusiasm or commitment. She really was so bummed that she couldn't make it. And she's hopeful that, you know, she can connect with folks after this, and is looking forward to watching the video. But first we have Dr. Sean Baldry. Sean is Associate Professor of Sociology at Purdue University. He got his PhD in sociology, and his research is generally, I think, in quantitative methods and health disparities. I really like his work because he looks at complex factors over time and across generations, and puts together social relationships. And you do that cool thing of looking at statistical tools also, like you're a methodologist in addition to a sociologist. So super excited to have you today. And then we'll have Dr. Jamie Lynch. Dr. Lynch is Associate Professor of Sociology and Director of the Strategic Research Institute at St. Norbert's College. And I really appreciate his work because you look at endogenous relationships, and that's super tricky, right? And so I'm, for one, interested in those endogenous relationships like education and health. So looking forward to your comments today. And then third, we have Dr. Joo-Hee Woo, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology at Appalachian State, did I say that right? Appalachian State University. She received her PhD in sociology, and she uses mixed methods approaches in her research, looking at health disparities. She's doing some super innovative stuff, considering a lot of dimensions around a particular behavior, and thinking about those lifestyle dimensions that we often don't think that we can look at because it's so thorny methodologically. So I'm really looking forward to hearing these speakers. So Sean, you want to take it away?
Great, sounds good. Sounds good, Liz. And thanks for the introduction. Thanks for, it's nice to see some folks here that I recognize. Yeah, today what I'm going to talk a little bit about is, or I'm going to focus my comments on the measurement of health lifestyles. And you know, this is a thing, like as a methodologist, I think a lot about, that I think is maybe perhaps a bit dry in some ways, but I think actually there are interesting theoretical implications around this, opportunities for integrating qualitative and quantitative work that I think you know, we can discuss a bit more. And then also just a little bit I'll say about some possibilities for alternative statistical models that might emerge from this. I'm not going to talk that long, just have a few thoughts here, and then look forward to conversation afterwards. So, you know, I'm sure as people realize or recognize, a kind of a latent class approach to analyzing health lifestyles has become quite popular. You know, probably started somewhere on the order of 5 to 10 years ago, but it feels like now, at least with statistical analyses of health lifestyles, it's kind of the dominant approach. And it's, you know, fairly obvious why. I mean, the model, the latent class model, you know, posits an underlying categorical latent variable for health lifestyles behaviors that are measured by individual health behaviors. And that has a number of strengths over, you know, past approaches that we were using. It's particularly good at identifying subpopulations of people adopting similar lifestyles, and that's the sort of the categorical piece of this. We can identify these different groups, and it has an affinity with a sort of a person-centered approach that is broader, sort of in the psychological world and developmental science world, way of thinking about analyses that I think has a nice affinity with health lifestyles research. Another strength is that it avoids the kind of continuum from unhealthy to healthy lifestyles that, not having, if we had a continuous latent variable or various sort of scales and indices that we've used in the past, we're often stuck with that simple continuum. And I think it's been one of the key things that has emerged out of the work on using a latent class approach is that health lifestyles don't really line up that neatly. They have different dimensions and, might be healthy in some ways and, less healthy in other ways. And it's not always obvious, how to just stick them on, a single unidimensional continuum. People might argue with me about this, but I feel it's generally fairly easy to incorporate predictors and outcomes of latent classes. There's a couple different options for how to do that, but it can be, this sort of approach to measuring health lifestyles can be embedded in broader statistical models. And so it's proven beneficial. However, so a few thoughts on challenges. And these are things that I guess I've been thinking a bit about lately, and trying to think about how to push methods a little bit further on this. And I'm just going to mention two key ones. The first one is which health behaviors should inform our measurement of health lifestyles. And I feel like we don't have a lot of agreement on this across different groups doing research, and also just broadly, in the field. And I've talked a little bit about this before, and I've been thinking a bit more about it lately. That I think we can really think about two broadly different approaches, and there are some strengths and weaknesses of each. So I'm not sure that we would want to have one approach or the other dominate, but I think it helps us understand how to push this forward. One approach, which I'll characterize as a parsimonious approach, really focuses on a relatively small number of health behaviors, often maybe 4 to 5, 5 to 6, something like that are really oriented towards domains of health behaviors that are most well known to be associated with health outcomes, right? And so we have some of our classic ones of like diet, fitness or exercise, drinking, substance use, these sorts of things. And I think that the strength of this approach, and something that is sort of the next step for this work, is to really think about comparisons across studies and try to think about validating health lifestyles and understanding, can we get to a place where we can actually predict what health lifestyles might be present in a population. An alternative approach is a holistic approach that really captures a more nuanced understanding of lifestyles. In this approach, people include a lot broader range of health behaviors. And so you might see, studies with maybe 20 or 30 different types of health behaviors that capture like quite a large gamut of types of things that could be relevant for a health lifestyle, and this I think is also a valuable approach in understanding kind of the breadth of lifestyles, right, and the different ways that they manifest. I was struck yesterday in one of the roundtable sessions. There was a question about whether or not people understand themselves as adopting a lifestyle, like whether the measures that we're using, are capturing things that people see, and whether or not that's important. And I don't have a good answer to that question. I mean, it's an interesting and provocative question, and one that I think maps onto this as well. Like the more that we, in some sense, I think the holistic approach does probably do a better job at capturing that than this sort of parsimonious approach. But this is an open question, and I think one to spend some time on. The next challenge that I'll say a little bit about, and I've been thinking about lately, is adopting more of a life course perspective and thinking about incorporating aging into the analysis. And I think this has several components. One, I was struck yesterday also with the keynote speakers talking about a question of structure and agency. Right, and how, you know, a lot of past lifestyles research and current lifestyles research really focuses a lot on structural factors and is really focused on, you know, background factors, you know, individual background factors, and then, you know, sort of structural factors in, you know, relatively early life, adolescence and young adulthood, that kind of set the stage for developing lifestyles. And that's, you know, we think of with Bourdieu and the habitus. You know, that's something that typically is thought of as kind of solidifying in late adolescence and young adulthood. There might be evolution a bit over the life course, but in his theorizing, it was early in life and sort of influenced it. But a life course perspective, and the thing that I've been thinking a bit more about, is what do health lifestyles look like among older adults? And, you know, as people, particularly as, you know, some of the health consequences of health lifestyles, you know, adopted in early adulthood begin to emerge, right? And, you know, sort of in ages 50s, 60s, and so on, you know, do people then adapt or, you know, adopt different lifestyles in reaction to information they're receiving? And I think this is an interesting way of thinking about the potential for agency. And then, of course, there's also, this brings up really interesting questions of, you know, what sorts of opportunities or resources are needed to even get this sort of information, and, you know, to potentially alter one's health lifestyle. And that itself, you know, could be, well, it certainly is patterned. In terms of measurement, I think there's two pieces here. Like, there's thinking about the evolution of health lifestyles over the life course, so it's sort of a dynamic perspective on what health lifestyles look like. And there has been some work on that, but it's been mostly at early stages of the life course, right? Like, mostly looking at like how lifestyles might be evolving among early children and then into adolescence. I think having a much longer range could be nice. This is quite challenging, though, until we, you know, can kind of nail down our measurement of the health lifestyles, because partially what's changing and what we've seen in the, you know, some of the early period stuff is simply the health behaviors that go into the measurement. And so, you know, partially we're capturing changing health behaviors, and then, you know, and it's not clear how much that's really a change in the health lifestyle. And so that's another feature, is the changing measures of health behaviors over the life course. This has been thought of, I think, among you know, adolescents and young adults a bit more than among older adults. But I think that, you know, there's really some opportunity there to think about what types of health behaviors might be most important to include as a measure of a health lifestyle. And, you know, some obvious possibilities include things like, you know, engaging in routine healthcare or preventive healthcare. And those sorts of things, but there are likely to be other types of things that are worth thinking about. So just to sort of see a little bit about where I see some opportunities, and, you know, I'll sort of wrap up here. I think that, you know, this is really, broadly speaking, I think the work on health lifestyles is really an exciting area. There's a ton of wide open questions, and so, you know, I try to think just specifically about measurement, but, you know, I don't mean in any ways to suggest that, you know, there aren't other types of opportunities available for this work. With qualitative work, I think, in terms of informing measurement, identifying the key domains of health behaviors, particularly how, you know, getting to that question that came up in the roundtables yesterday, how do people actually think of their own health lifestyle? What would they include? You know, as important, let's say, broad categories of health behaviors, and then maybe some specific ones. You know, how does that work? And then also, how do people, you know, how can we contextualize life course processes? So, you know, I can kind of assert, and I think we can see in some data, that when people have like a health event of some sort, or receive a diagnosis, that they might change certain domains of health behaviors that might lead to a health lifestyle. But actually understanding how that experience plays out for people, I think, could really inform work on the measurement aspect and understanding these processes over time. On the quantitative side, I think there's two things that I think are particularly, at least on my mind, as opportunities. Still within the LCA framework, I think that there's an opportunity for trying to validate health lifestyles. We've done very little of this. I think we have different health lifestyles emerge across different populations. It's difficult because we don't often have data on the same sorts of cohorts at the same periods of time. But there are some emerging possibilities. Like one I'll say I'm exploring right now is the NLSY79 folks are reaching the same age as the beginning HRS folks. And so you can have two pretty large scale nationally representative surveys to try to, understand, do we see similar lifestyles emerge among these different, in these similar populations, but using different data sources. And I think this would be really helpful for people doing work in this area. I'm sure you encounter reviewers who are concerned about the inductive nature of LCA and, sort of say like, well, you're guaranteed to find some sort of clustering. And so, and if you can't predict anything about it in advance, then this is not that useful of an analysis. And I think as we're getting more data online and a broader base of studies using this framework, we should be able to do better. Like we should be able to say some stuff about, well, we can actually, make some, provide some expectations about what health lifestyles will emerge among what particular populations and, particular age groups. The other thing that I've been struck by, and I, this is an area that's just, I haven't made any progress on, but it's sort of on my, ever lengthening to-do list, is to look at some of what European life course research has really been moving forward a lot with sequence analysis that kind of fell out of fashion in US-based research following some early critiques of the method in the 2000s. Or early 2000s, but the Europeans kind of pushed forward with it, and there's certainly a couple folks in the U.S. who've been doing some work with this as well. But they're really, I think this could be a pretty interesting way of looking at the evolution of health lifestyles. If we could even potentially looking at just a few focal health behaviors and understanding their interrelationships and how they're unfolding over time and the patterns unfolding over time. In the European perspective, the stuff that I've seen has been a lot on the transition to adulthood and looking at, say, 4 or 5 dimensions around emerging adulthood and tracking those, over periods of like 15 to 20 years in early, let's say late adolescence to middle age. And I think very similar types of analyses could be done with health behaviors with similar approaches. And I think that could give us a bit of a handle on the evolution of health lifestyles. Okay, so those are just a few thoughts around this. I'm sure other folks will share some thoughts as well, and we can have a conversation about what sorts of opportunities are available.
Awesome, thanks so much. I'm gonna resist the urge. I have several questions. I might disagree with you on a couple things, or maybe. Anyway, but I will resist that urge. And Jamie, do you want to share your slides?
Great. Okay. I'm very excited to be here. I appreciate the topic, and I'm thankful to the organizers for putting together a worthwhile conference in an absurd time. I also have a complaint. I don't appreciate following Sean. Our vision is always cloudy after we look at bright objects. So Liz, in the future, please save the stars for the end of the presentations, not at the middle or beginning. Let's talk about innovative methods. I hope today that some of my comments will help someone in the audience develop an innovative approach to lifestyles research, or I think will probably raise some interesting questions. A new paper highlights an important point, helpfully right in the title and in the abstract. Health lifestyles are often situated in discrete life stages, maybe childhood, adolescence, old age, so on. Add on to that we often limit our indicators to a single measure or two, or some tiny cluster of health behaviors. Add to that many of the large quantitative data sets we use for health lifestyle analysis frequently must be bent, broken, or abused to accommodate this method. Add to that complete cases are often required for most analyses in dealing with this. We have trouble with missing data. And you know what? We face some challenges when doing lifestyle analysis. And I think Sean addressed many of these, and I want to talk a little bit about possible solutions and some of the risks we take when making these kinds of decisions. These data limitations, I think, block really interesting questions about health lifestyle research. In particular, they really put a big block on rare events, especially rare events with big implications for components of health lifestyle research. For example, early adolescent drug use and depression, perhaps comparatively rare, but have very important consequences for patterning health lifestyles and are important predictors for outcomes that might happen in the future. But because they exist in such rare quantities, often in our data sets, either because our data set started measurement too late or because we just made compromises in data collection, we have trouble getting enough sample or enough events of this to make it meaningful. We also have issues like teenage childbirth, or the list kind of can go on and on of rare events that we might have that can have a really big impact on health lifestyles. It's a challenge to measure these rare events with most of the typical data that we use to measure health lifestyles. Sometimes our limitations are poor representations of racial and ethnic minorities in our data. In other words, some data sets have diverse samples, but they have few lifestyle measures. And other data, and the reverse is also true for other data sets. Sometimes the event or lifestyle is rare simply because it's uncommon for a specific group, and that in itself makes it hard to measure and limits our ability to understand it as a health lifestyle in any sort of broadly meaningful or predictive way. It can also be a challenge to measure lifestyles across different life stages when data sets tend to censor the measures in some important way. Either they're capturing data at one particular lifetime, or funding just says, this is how far you go and stop, and now we're going to build another data set that's like it, and we're not going to make it easy for you to connect it. So we face challenges like this when we're dealing with measuring and predicting health lifestyles. There's a lot of challenges. I think Sean covered a lot of these well, and I want to expand just a little bit on that. One way we can think about improving our approach to this is by using auxiliary variables in our methods and models for producing health lifestyles. In general, we can think of an auxiliary variable as something that may be part of the model, but may not be part of the analysis. And I'll give a couple of explanations of how that can be useful. For example, you want to measure a health lifestyle in adulthood, but then you can use childhood data to help impute the adult measures that otherwise would have been left out of the analysis. And the reverse is also true. So by using an approach like this, it helps us increase the efficiency of our estimates and can hopefully reduce eliminating rare events from our health lifestyle analysis. Maybe, maybe not. When we think about this, for auxiliary variables to be useful, there needs to be a lot of missing data. Some estimates need to be near the border of significance, or at least meaningful in some regards. And the auxiliary variables must be excellent predictors of the missing values. It can't just be any old variable. It has to have a clear and excellent predictive quality to it. When we do this, it can improve our sample size or the efficiency of our models and can push certain estimates into significance in a way that's useful for telling the important stories of health lifestyles in ways maybe we haven't always been able to before. An example from my own research has been studying the education BMI gradient for Hispanic women. This isn't maybe necessarily exactly what we think of as a health lifestyle, but it's an example that's analogous to kind of what we're tackling here. So the rare event in this example is college degree attainment for Hispanic women in their late 20s. This event is comparatively rare because it's rare, and also because there's limited sample sizes measuring this. So it's rare on two fronts. Using the NLSY 97 data, we had an interest in measuring essentially the education BMI trajectories in early young adulthood to later adolescence, or the reverse of that, later adolescence to early young adulthood. And in doing so, we need to figure out a way to measure this. At first, we had to remove this analysis because we had simple lack of power. There wasn't easy ways to measure this because the incidence was so rare. This limited our ability to say something important and take a population health approach to this analysis. We were limited from saying something about Hispanic women because data limited us, but not because there wasn't a story to tell. So using the NLSY 97, it was a perfect setup for using this type of analysis with multiple imputation because we had multiple measures of body mass index and educational attainment in young adulthood, early adolescence, and later. We had about 12 different years of the same measures. By using this, we were able to improve our sample efficiency by eliminating the missing values that took place at the beginning of the analysis, so those who were 16 years old, and those at the end of the analysis, those who are 28, by using both of those variables to predict each other. Now, people may scoff at that, and there may be a little bit of controversy surrounding that. But essentially, we use the future to explain the past and the past to predict the future simultaneously in an imputation model. And in doing so, we were able to retain a number of analyses and statements otherwise would have been excluded from our analysis simply because of limitations of the data that we should be able to overcome when we're doing this kind of analysis. I think the same thing is true for data that we think of that's less rare, or sorry, the data that's more rare and events that are limited. And there's a couple ways I think that we can do something new and interesting to address questions like this and move this kind of research forward. The first is that because our data get more accurate with time, I think it's time to go back to some of our initial analyses that set the stage for health lifestyle research and re-estimate those models using some of the new data we have to multiply impute those data and forget about removing, even if it was a simple list-wise deletion, but simply go back and re-estimate those models. This is a growing field, and as Sean mentioned, we're aging with our data as we look at this. So let's actually go back, let's replicate the analyses we've had in longitudinal data set, make sure that they replicate when we add in new cases, and let's expand our analyses. I can think of a number of papers that had to limit their ability, at least I assume they limited their ability to talk about racial and ethnic differences or occupational class differences because the data was so small. Well, the data grows over time, so let's go back and update those analyses. We can also re-estimate original trajectories within those same data to see if the classes still make sense with this additional information. Chances are they do, but wouldn't it be nice to be sure? The second way of thinking about this is that as our rare events become less rare over time. As our data get older, we can go back and measure things like teenage drug use very well if we have information about future drug use. We can now go back and predict and impute that data in the past using data in the future because it is a good predictor of that. Now, we may remove that data from the analysis when it's in there, but in terms of building the imputation model, I think we have some advantages that we can take greater use of. So when I think about this as an overall perspective, I think we're doing a pretty good job with health lifestyle analysis, but I'm worried about what's ending up on the cutting room floor of analyses that could be brought back into the analysis to make stronger statements. In particular, I think we're losing a broad population health perspective by not carefully considering what types of racial and ethnic analysis gets lost because of low sample sizes, low power, and low efficiency in our data. And I've got more to share when we get to a discussion, but that's all I have to share for slides.
Great, thanks so much. Again, resisting the urge to ask questions immediately and turning over. Juhi, do you have slides?
Yep. All right, so thank you for having me in this panel. I'm happy to share my qualitative research in health lifestyles. So I was invited to share my research experience, my experience with qualitative approach to studying health lifestyles. And so I'm going to focus on two case studies, two studies that I conducted in the past few years, focusing on cigarette smoking, which is one of health behaviors that many researchers are interested in studying. So in this short talk, I hope it's short. If I go more than 10 minutes, just let me know. But I want to talk about why I became interested and why I decided to choose the qualitative approach to studying health lifestyles, and also the two main lessons that I learned while working on this project. So I decided to conduct in-depth interviewing for my research because my interest of population was hidden population. And also there was some paradox that I wanted to understand. And these approaches are based on quantitative findings. The first project I conducted was Korean women smoking behavior, because I'm from South Korea, and coming from that country and knowing their social norms and culture, and also based on the findings that Korean women tend to underreport smoking behavior, I wanted to look at this hidden population. So, for example, according to surveys, about 5 to 8% of Korean women smoke cigarettes, but there were some studies that compared survey findings with urine tests. And according to urine tests, about 20% of women actually smoke cigarettes. So what about this 50% of women who do not report their smoking behavior in surveys? And how do we understand their smoking behavior and other lifestyles that might matter, right? That's why I had to start interviewing people that I know who smoke cigarettes, and they try to understand their health behaviors. And another project that I used qualitative methods was, again, focusing on cigarette smoking, African-American women who live in the south side of Chicago, which is racially very segregated and historically marginalized areas of the city. So there's health paradox, African-American smoking paradox. So African-Americans start smoking later than other racial ethnic groups, and also they show lower levels of smoking in young adulthood and adolescence. And within smokers, African-Americans smoke a lower number of cigarettes as compared to other racial ethnic groups. But despite these seemingly favorable smoking behaviors and patterns, they get sick or they die more from lung cancer or other smoking-related health issues compared to other racial ethnic groups. So I wanted to understand what's going on, right? What is behind these smoking patterns, maybe that might explain this smoking paradox. And like I mentioned, these research questions came from quantitative findings about general smoking patterns and behaviors among these groups. And I wanted to look into further to see what's going on within this specific group of people. So things I've learned while working on this project is, first, places matter. So I started interviewing Korean women smokers in my hometown back in South Korea. And I started from interviewing the people that I know, and they asked them to introduce somebody that they know smoking cigarettes, right? And I also posted flyers in a women's restroom in local college. And while going through these interviews, I found out most of these women go to coffee shops to smoke cigarettes, which is really interesting, because in Korean society, smoking is had a greater stigma for women. So women cannot smoke anywhere they want, as compared to men who can smoke on the street, right? So women selectively chose these places where they can freely smoke. So after finding out, the fact that many women selectively go to these places to smoke cigarettes, later my job was actually just going to coffee shops in my hometown, right? Randomly visit different coffee shops that had smoking room, and then wait there for like hours sometimes, just minding my business. And if I see a woman who goes to, smoking room and then start smoking, I will go ask for interview, right? So that's how I recruited, my interviewees in the second part of my research. And so the location where most of my study participants, spend their time and smoke cigarettes, and also my, research, the interview location, right? Because I went there and then found my interviewees and also conducted my interviews there. This place informed me not only about their smoking behavior, but their daily life, and also how smoking in these small, tiny places may affect their health and smoking behavior in general, right? And another place is the south side of Chicago. So when I was conducting my interviews in this area, I was actually living there, right? I lived there for 2 years while I was collecting and analyzing my data, so I could validate what I hear because I could observe people living there, right? Daily life. So when some of things that I found from my data analysis were high, prevalent smoking in their neighborhoods and high visibility of smoking in their neighborhoods, and also illegal transaction of loose cigarettes. And these things are what I saw every single day, walking around the city and riding the CTA, the transportation, right? And also, I want to talk about this example of one interview. So sometimes the interview were happening inside of my car or coffee shop, or other times I went into my interviewee's place, their apartment, their house, right? And one interviewee was living in an apartment, Section 8 apartment, government assistance housing, and she had kids who have asthma, right? Most of her kids have asthma, and she tells me she doesn't smoke inside her house. But the moment you step into the building, you smell cigarettes. Not because the mother is smoking, but because other people who live in the apartment smoke cigarettes too, right? So sometimes the interview data doesn't match with maybe what's really going on, but while actually paying attention to these locations, right, where these interviewees are located and live, and also the interview place informs you about bigger picture. And the second thing I've learned from my research experience is processes matter. So what I found from the first case of Korean women smokers, I found that a lot of these interviewees were engaged in binge smoking. But going back to where they smoke, right? Because of the high stigma around smoking, they could not smoke at home. They could not smoke at their workplace. They had to smoke within certain time at certain places. In this case, coffee shop smoking room, right? So how does that affect their smoking behavior? They could spend maybe 2 to 3 hours within a day in this coffee shop, right? And within these 2 to 3 hours, they smoke 4 to 5 cigarettes in a row because they think that's the only time they can smoke. Once they get out of the coffee shop, they cannot smoke because of the social stigma, or maybe people that they associate with don't know the fact that they are smokers. So because of this limited time and location, they binge smoked, right? And from the second case, among the Black women smokers and queers in Chicago, I found that a lot of women smoke loose cigarettes, right? Because these women were very socioeconomically marginalized. They didn't have enough money. With limited income, they could not purchase a pack of cigarettes. So what they did was they would buy an individual cigarette from the people outside on the street or from their neighbors, right? And then smoke when they can. And also, every one of my 40 interviewees smoked menthol cigarettes. And studies have found, high consumption of menthol cigarettes among African American communities. But really, like every single one of my interviewees smoked menthol cigarettes, either Newport or Cool. There were only 2 brands. And within those 2 brands, Newport was the most popular brand. And within Newport, there are different lengths. And most of my interviewees smoke Newport 100, which is the longer version of regular Newport. And the reason why these women choose to smoke Newport 100 is because they want to maximize their benefit. With limited income, right? If you smoke longer cigarettes, they believe they can smoke more. So what they do is smoke the half first, and then go about their day, and then come back later, right? And then smoke the other half. So actually smoking the entire cigarette, right? So these kind of things cannot be captured when we do surveys, right? These processes, how they make decisions about what types of cigarette they smoke, and even how they smoke these cigarettes, right? Smoking entire cigarette, right, throughout the day, because they cannot smoke as many cigarettes as they want, right? So this is the picture of Newport 100. So by approaching this topic, qualitatively, I could understand how social norms and policies, even marketing, right, and also socioeconomic status, physical and social environments, all intertwine together to explain the types of cigarettes smoked and how they are smoked by these people. So I believe the key point, the importance and contribution of qualitative approach to studying health lifestyle is this, a fine-grained analysis of how health lifestyles play out within a health behavior. In my case, this was smoking, right? So we could look at a history of smoking in other health behavior and lifestyles and social physical environments. And I also asked my interviewees about their own perception of their health and their being smoker and other smokers, and how they see themselves, how they see themselves in terms of their health status and condition too. So we could look at their life course. And I also asked about how their smoking pattern have changed over time, right? And focusing on intersection of their race, gender, and socioeconomic status, and other social statuses, right? And also looking at not just individual behavior, but also neighborhood effect and bigger community, and how structural barrier might influence these women's smoking behavior and other lifestyles. And another strength of qualitative approach is we can incorporate unexpected things as analysis and data collection goes by. I never thought I would recruit my study participants in coffee shop. One of my work was actually just going to visiting different coffee shops in town and then spending time there until I find some women smoking cigarettes there. And also these findings from qualitative approach can inform quantitative research in the future. In my case, based on these findings, I actually included parental smoking status and religiosity into quantitative analysis in my dissertation. Okay, that's about it.
Awesome, thanks so much. Super interesting, really nice set of 3 talks that are, I'm now feeling like maybe we should, I'm seeing mostly quantitative people in this session, and maybe we should think about qualitative methods, because Juhi, you were able to talk about a lot of things that we just can't get to in the surveys. Okay, so let's open up for Q&A. I think I'm going to take the moderator privilege of perhaps getting us started. And maybe from a basic place about thinking about how we operationalize the variables for health lifestyles. Jimmy put something in a chat about, do we need to observe the lifestyles as a whole, or can we look at just these indicators? And I also kind of want to bring in, because I think Sean and Jamie, I think you both talked about sort of validating and and Jamie, you talked about replicating old stuff, and my opinion, or I guess perspective, is that that kind of validation and replication of health lifestyles isn't going to be terribly useful, because we're never going to be able to get the same results. Like, it's just so sensitive to operationalization. So how do we think about that when thinking about operationalizing these? Yeah, so can you, whoever wants to jump in first with thoughts?
I'm happy to say some stuff.
Okay.
Go from there. So I saw Jimmy's question. Maybe it's a good starting point. I think there's absolutely, I see the connection with the point you raised yesterday. And I think there's a couple things going on. Like, I guess in my mind, I think of health lifestyles as kind of a latent concept. And as a latent concept, you wouldn't necessarily expect to observe all aspects of it in general, right? Like, we could think of other types of latent concepts, I don't know, like maybe depressive symptoms or something like that. And we just try to tap into pieces of it with observable measures. But in terms of what you're saying about, so that's like, in theory, we can understand that. But if we want to measure it, we still need some observable measures to build a measure of the latent concept from. And that really is a big question, I think. And this, I guess, in my mind, gets to Liz, your comment about your pessimism around the potential validity. I think that stems from, and I think you're right, if we have a perspective on health lifestyles that is capturing their full richness and nuance, then I agree it's probably not going to be easy to validate that or replicate that. It's very sensitive, to try to pull that out. But I'm wondering if there is room for a more, I guess I would call it a parsimonious vision of what, how to measure a health lifestyle. Like, perhaps it's possible we can capture a lot of what's happening, but certainly not all of it. But, with 4 or 5 well-chosen measures, question is, what would be those measures? And, are they stable across the life course? And, when do we have those? If we could do that, then I think we could validate this. And I think that would be something that would be valuable. I do think that this sort of whole research program kind of does have a bit of an issue with not, needing a bit of that, needing a little bit more of a foundation than just saying that, it's a rich, complex topic or concept that we can't hope to observe in multiple data sources the same way. But that's not, I get, like, there's other pieces that are, valuable also, capturing the nuances and the richness of it too. So I'm not suggesting not to do that part, just that there's a potential value in a different approach.
Yeah.
Can I clarify something about my question briefly there? So I guess observable can mean a lot of different things, and I'm realizing that I think I haven't been clear on that. And same with kind of the Sean's point of, like, kind of being aware of membership in a class. And all I mean is that, like, the individual, I'm actually thinking about the individual indicators may or may not be observable, whereas the class identity may be, whereas the, like, awareness of being a part of that class may or may not be kind of key dimension of it. And I guess I'm thinking of that paper a handful of years ago, Why Do Liberals Drink Lattes, right? And kind of the ways that behaviors kind of cluster together. Sometimes they're observable behaviors, sometimes they're not observable behaviors, but the, like, collectiveness of those, kind of the way those kind of indicators would cluster together might be very observable, even if some of the indicators aren't, if you will. And that's the part that I'm kind of wrestling with. And I'll admit that part of this is wrestling with an editor from a while ago, where the editor was convinced the only thing that would matter for group identity were things that other people could see. And I'm like, why is that necessarily so? And his answer was, because it should be. That's about as much as he had. And so I guess that's where a lot of this is stemming from, is just trying to think about, like, what matters on the kind of identification from the internal view. Part of the question is what all of this is spinning around for me.
And can I, Patrick, I think you were clapping when Sean was saying something, and maybe, do you want to say why you were clapping?
I was raising my hand, but the meanings of emojis are mysterious things. one thing that, this is a little bit of a shift, but one thing that really struck me about some of the talks here was this sort of life course approach. And one thing that I think that we don't always deal with well in our thinking about health lifestyles is how some behaviors clearly have a strong force toward continuity over life and others don't. Like, it's easy for a person to not get a flu shot last year and to decide that this year they will. There's clearly some correlation over time, but it's likely weaker than smoking, where you might initiate smoking for one set of reasons, but by the time you're 40, you're very unlikely to start smoking. But if you are smoking, it's very hard to quit, right? And so like that, I think, makes the way that lifestyles unfold over the life course really complicated, because some of these behaviors have strong continuity and others don't. And you know, I myself use a lot of cross-sectional data where it's really hard to unpack exactly what that means, right? When you're looking at folks that are age 60 or 70, we're largely looking at smoking cessation and not smoking initiation, which is very different than adolescence. And I thought it'd be interesting to hear the panelists comment on what they thought about those life course dynamics and also the characters of specific health behaviors.
I guess what I would say about that is that, yes, that's right. And part of it is that we're having to figure out creative ways to get our data sets to measure things like that in unusual ways. So if you're measuring something like smoking cessation, how confident are you that it isn't just, I didn't take my flu shot this year and didn't do that, but it's actually, did you stop the behavior and did we do that? And how are we measuring those parts? I think the answer to that is very complicated, and probably why we need more qualitative work into that, or measures. So in some research with prisoners, they'll do these event history calendars that are working, where you can ask people to use anchor points to go back about when they made a decision and measure that specific change that took place. It's imperfect, but it offers a different approach to thinking about when those decisions happen that are probably going to be masked by a measure of, did you cease? When did you cease? How did you do that? And instead building it perhaps in the way in which people think about their lifestyles, which probably aren't discrete indicators, but are at meaningful moments, and doing that. So my answer would be, I totally affirm that that's an important part. I think in my mind, I think of those as rare events because it's the unusual that happens in there. By definition, that cessation at 50 or something is maybe unusual, or if they haven't been censored by, you know, a health effect that that happened at that place. But that is I think the core area for clever methods that allow people to respond not just as indicators, but as measures that can be anchored to some other, like an event history or some sort of part, is a method that will be much more powerful for figuring that out than just using that kind of single indicator research. So just a thought on that.
So Jamie, that brings up the point that Sean made about sequence analysis as potentially a useful tool. But I think every once in a while I'm like, oh yeah, it would be so cool to do sequence analysis, and I learned how to do it and everything, and then I go to the data and it just doesn't. I just don't have the data. Like, you don't know when these things are happening. And Sean, do you have any thoughts about, are there data that you think could be used? Because I mean, ad health is like, if I can't do sequence analysis with ad health, then what else is there?
Fair enough. No, I mean, like, you know, this isn't something I've explored in a lot of detail yet, but I'll say, you know, a couple possibilities, right? Or some of our data sets are getting long enough that, you know, and, you know, ad health is actually a frustrating longitudinal data set in most respects. Like, it's not as good as I would like in many ways. But like HRS and some of the NLS stuff, you know, you're getting more waves. There are different periods of life course, and so there's issues there. But a lot of this stuff, right, that's coming out of Europe are using European data sets, and they do have more, you know, some nicer longitudinal data sets to work with. They're usually smaller sample sizes. You don't have the same sort of, you know, the representativeness is not quite as clean, but like the German socioeconomic panel study, for instance, the version of the PSID in Germany, has been doing a lot of interesting things. There's some stuff in Switzerland, smaller scale, where there's a lot better longitudinal data. And so that's where these people are getting their data to do the sequence analyses that I think likely have health behavior measures, but it's not something I've looked into as much yet. So.
think one sort of confounding issue that goes with this is that the determinants of things that happen early in life can be different from the determinants of the continuity of that behavior in later life. And oftentimes when we have a panel, say HRS, where we observe folks in later life, we miss big chunks of early life. And when we see, data sets for early life, like ECLS, or even Ad Health, then we tend to miss what drives continuity in those behaviors over time. And I don't know, I always have that in the back of my head because it's such an obvious process when it comes to behaviors, right? The reason we start playing sports in high school is different from the reason why we exercise when we're middle-aged, even though there's a continuity in physical activity to some extent in life. It's really puzzling, I think, because some of the meanings of behaviors themselves change over time as the measures stay the same, or the measure has to change over time, even if the meaning can stay the same. And those things make it really hard to even imagine what it would look like to measure, say, physical activity among toddlers, even though we know that some toddlers are running around a lot more than others, and what that means when kids get to high school, or when they get to midlife, or when they get to their 60s.
Yeah, I agree that it feels like our methods are so inadequate sometimes, and especially like when you were talking, and it's like, man, quantitative methods, like we just can't even get close. Like we're like smoking, yes or no, and you're talking about brands and length, and and I think that that's like a broader question about, we keep coming back to the nuanced version or the like broader version, and I find the nuance more interesting, but it's much harder. I don't know, panelists, you have no solutions.
Yeah, certainly no solution, but I do think, I guess I'd want to emphasize, I think this is also a theoretical problem, not just a methodological problem. And the sorts of processes Patrick's talking about are really, I think, under theorized in health lifestyles work. Like we have a fairly static view of how they emerge and when they emerge and what they represent. And so I think there really is a lot of room, for theoretical innovation to understand precisely what's being described. It's true that the data requirements are going to be substantial, and we can use this sort of usual array of social science methods to chip away at it with limitations in all of them. But I do think the theory is probably lagging, and that's probably where we've got some room for movement first.
And part of this is that we are built to look at matrices in R and Stata and do things with them. And how much of this are we ignoring, the power of the cell phone that exists here, and figuring out clever ways in which, what better data collection is there right now than a health lifestyle, than if we could get access into phones? And nobody's saying do that, but there's these variables exist in much nicer and much nicer ways than we want. And how much of this is a function of finding the right partnerships to work with folks that have access to those kinds of data, and finding those partnerships to say, we have these really interesting theoretical parts, let's find a good way to make use of that data. This is obviously a big leap beyond there, but this data is there. We have that data there. We just don't have it how we like it. So if we can figure out a way to make those connections, to find that part, all the theory there, we've got, the variables exist, information exists to test this. We just don't quite have access. Now, how do we get there? I'm ready for that panel, but I won't be on it. So I'm excited for that one.
Did you, in terms of partners, did you mean like grocery store, because I have seen public health folks that work with, grocery stores or Nielsen ratings, or, you know what I mean? Is that the kind of partnerships you're thinking about, or?
So I'm struck I don't know how many of us got the chance, at ASA too many years ago to remember, but when I was in San Francisco and Facebook hosted a set of people that came from ASA, and I got a chance to go over there and do that, and I'm struck by the amount of folks that have been hired at Google, that have been hired at Facebook, that are working with Yahoo, that have a social PhD and are doing those parts and are interested in being able to tackle questions like this. So I mean, partners from, you want to get local, absolutely go to talk to Whole Foods, but not Whole Foods, you're local if you have a local grocery store doing that. But also there's so many folks that are leaving grad school with PhDs and are entering industry like these parts that, we've got secret agents that are there that we can work with to make these connections. Now, I don't know how to do that, but you can't tell me that a cell phone doesn't have the best health lifestyle information available out there and that we could make use of it in some interesting way.
Yeah, I think I have some ethical concerns about that. And then, I mean, that brings up the question of you looking at how you use your phone. Is it in itself a health lifestyle? I think my phone usage during the pandemic has not been helping my health lifestyle. Yes, I don't need those weekly reports of my screen time to do that. Jimmy, did you have a question?
Actually, I have a comment about that idea from Jamie. So for the last year, I've been involved in a lot of kind of COVID modeling at the state level. And my main role has been looking at kind of digital trace data and in a variety of capacities. And I would argue that most of those data are going to cause more severe versions of the problems Jamie was saying earlier that we would want to really kind of dive into with health lifestyles, about kind of disparities, differences by various kind of socio-demographic groups and such, because lower SES, racial minority, and kind of rural populations are much less likely to opt into digital trace data, being able to make them useful. And so you're going to get a more privileged and more kind of urban and more white set of data out of digital trace data by and large. Than you are most others. And I mean, this includes, talking to people at Facebook who have access not just to the stuff that they can share with me, but they have access to the whole kind of behind the scenes parts of it. And they want to supplement it with so many other things that would allow us to do the things Jamie was nudging for earlier, that I think it would potentially drive the wrong direction for this type of set of questions. I should say there are capabilities, but I just don't think they're the panacea that I think a lot of people have started thinking there because of the granularity.
If anyone has a question, feel free to put your hand up. I've got more stuff to chat about. Panelists, feel free to pose a question as well. I don't want to drive the conversation too much. But I did want to kind of just bring up this bigger idea about, sorry, I keep coming back to the nuance and validity and all this kind of stuff, because I just think it's really important. And, I feel like sometimes we're moving away from our significance fetish in terms of you got to get the Peels less than 0.05 to get published, and thinking about publication bias, but also just satisfying reviewers that they want to see a test where you can say yes or no. And health lifestyles is because of it's so tricky that I think it's especially hard to think about these ideas of significance tests, and LCA doesn't have really a good significance test. So I'm wondering what folks' thoughts are on that. And Juhi, please feel free to weigh in on quant stuff. I know you know about it too, so don't feel like you can only answer things about qual.
I guess just a quick thought. I mean, I see the challenge. I think I'm mean, at least I'm hopeful that we're moving away from, you know, the sort of fetishization of significance tests, and that reviewers will catch up with that. That's not to say, like, you know, there's some degree of understanding, you know, like I guess I see as LCA as a largely descriptive technique, and so, you know, appropriately contextualizing that and talking about that, and then, you know, potentially referencing uncertainty in different parameter estimates makes sense. That's not gonna, you know, I think one of the things you might be thinking about is, like, you know, finding models that have the best fit with the data and whether we have appropriate tests for that. And that's not, you know, that's a complicated issue with LCA. And I, you know, I think that's probably a different thing than the movement away from, you know, sort of seeing significance tests as thresholds for talking about stuff. Hopefully we'll continue our move in that direction, or, you know, away from that.
Okay, well, I'll ask another question, which is thinking about what behaviors to include or what indicators that we should be including, either the more parsimonious or the bigger version. And something I've been thinking about is, you know, this research field has been dominated by white folks and fairly privileged, because most of us have PhDs or are planning to get PhDs and have pretty good jobs. And what we think of as a health behavior isn't necessarily, it doesn't match with what affects health the most necessarily. You know, like why are the big four, you know, substance use, diet, exercise, why isn't sleep part of that, you know, big, you know, like that matters just as much as the others, but we don't include it. What are your thoughts about thinking about these behaviors and what to include? Yeah, sleep's a big one. Social relationships, is that not, that's not a health behavior, but it kind of is, like.
And just to be fair, Jimmy, every parent with a child believes in sleep. Every single one. I mean, my read of this is that we largely select our behaviors based on what's available in our big national surveys. And those largely reflect priorities from preventive medicine and public health, and their behaviors that we know have established links to mortality and morbidity. And I think that, and you know, and also like fundability, right? Like those surveys are driven by including items that are fundable and we have a strong base of research in. I don't know, I think it's really hard to diversify our measures when also using big population data sets where items are put in by consensus and there's a real premium on asking each additional question. You know, that's a real limiter. And I think the alternatives are collecting our own data, and as demographers, we do that occasionally, but we tend to think about collecting big data sets, and that tends to limit the scope of what we can ask. You know, there are trade-offs between sample size and depth of questions. And I don't know, I've often been frustrated by that, because you can imagine that when people think about their health, when I ask people what they do to take care of themselves, they'll say like, oh, I use aromatherapy, I read self-help books, I get downtime, I spend time with family and friends. All of these things that people think matter for their health that may, but not nearly as directly as smoking, but it clearly informs the way they act. And then there are a lot of things that we study that people don't clearly do with their health in mind. Like, people don't clearly sleep more because they are hoping to reduce cardiovascular risk in the future, right? People tend to sleep more because it feels good and they're tired and they're cognitively depleted without that sleep. And people don't often smoke because they're like, I can't wait to take 3 to 6 years off my life expectancy. They do it because of their peers and a whole variety of other dynamics that are not done with health in mind. And I don't think is health lifestyle researchers that we have a good understanding of what drives people's motivations from a sociological perspective, a psychological perspective, or what have you. And I think that our modeling is often driven by the data available, which is reasonable but frustrating.
Can I push back a little and say that you basically just absolved yourself of any responsibility in
Yeah, but I
blaming
feel a lot of guilt, so that makes it okay. As a Catholic, I understand the truth in that, or as, dare I say it, a recovering Catholic.
Oh, same, me too. I'm second generation recovering, I think.
I mean, the folks that I've known that got best into this sort of context around that, at least in my personal collaborations, really been like the Dick Jessers of the world in psychology, who work to think about peer models and peer pressures and parent models and parent pressures and religious models and things like that, which are very proximate. And they also tend to be very limited to, you know, college-based or high school-based surveys. And you know, I think in health lifestyles research, we sort of face those trade-offs very acutely in ways that, like, when I study mortality, that's not clearly an issue in the same way. Yeah, I don't know. That's what I would say the issue is, at least as I see it in the field.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think, I mean, I agree completely. And just trying to think through, like, what are some solutions? What are some things that we can think about as kind of creative ways to deal with this? Or is it really something that we just can't do anything about this? Or, you know?
I think data collection would be big, although I don't do data collection. I have no experience with that, but you know, there are fields that do and areas of the social science and demographic sciences that do. And I also think this is a great place to lean into other fields and, like, find collaborators. You know, I'm very well aware of my limits as a researcher, and I think it's important for us to, like, reach across the various aisles that are out there to psychologists or political scientists or economists or what have you, which is...
Well, let's not go too far with the economists.
Economists can be kind of cuddly sometimes.
I'm just
a little bit, not too much.
Juhi, what are your thoughts? Like, what kinds of things, like, as a qualitative, you know, you've seen the qualitative side, like, what kinds of things would you like to be able to include in surveys that you can't?
I think every research has, like, limitation, you know, like for quant, you know, we can generalize findings, but you cannot get like detailed information from respondents, right? And for qual people, you know, we cannot generalize our findings, but we can get into the details, right? So I think there's pros and cons for its, like, method and approach, but that's why I create my own data set, because I couldn't, you know, answer my research question with ad health data, you know, that I used to, you know, analyze. That's why I had to, you know, develop my own, you know, qualitative data to answer my research question. So I think one approach would be, you know, as long as you have, like, funding and time, I think you could create, like, survey maybe for one small set of population, like the university students. I think that's something I would like to do in the future, because I want to ask, like, a bunch of questions about e-cigarette use, you know, what kind of, you know, cigarettes are smoked and how they are smoking, you know, these cigarettes. So I think one option would be, you know, creating your own survey and, you know, conduct the survey with at least some population, you know, the population that you can reach. In my case, my university, you know, students. So, but you cannot generalize findings to the bigger population, I guess. So I think there's always pros and cons, and there's always limitation that we have to acknowledge.
And we need both, right? Like, we need to know kind of the general patterns, but then also the more specific nuanced things. Sean, Jamie, what are your thoughts on what variables to include? And can, you know, because I think the other idea about this is that it's so obvious, the the like increasing distinction, I guess, if we want to use Bourdieu's word, and health lifestyles are falling in that, like in our society generally. And I wasn't able to make Terrence's talk yesterday, but about conservatism and how can we start to think about these other lifestyle things that we don't necessarily think about health, but like obviously influences mask wearing, vaccine usage, right? Like it's so obvious.
So I think, Sean, or many people have mentioned earlier that we need to have more social relationships kind of included in there. As somebody working closely with young undergrad students, like many of us, it seems like the sexual behavior, sexual activity that have changed are really important ways. And now that people have access to partners that they haven't, in some of our historical research, your partner kind of needed to exist in the geography that you existed. And that's changed quite a bit, or people's access to that. So I think in those particular parts, we're thinking about that age range of the young adult to college student. But of course, that's by, narrowly defined. But I think maybe a broader question is, if we were starting with a fresh grad student and thinking about what are you going to spend the next 7 years thinking about to get prepared for doing this kind of analysis, what would we encourage them to think about? And I think that Sean made a really important point about the value of description in this work and letting theory inform that description. So if we're thinking about the particular variables, I love this concept of getting back to looking at small samples and getting a bunch of small samples where people are collecting data in areas that they can get rich access to, and then having meta-analyses of those or having larger scales up, because Patrick nailed it. We're beholden to other folks that are driving the data that we have access to. So we can be evangelical about it and start publishing our work in lots of different areas with the thick description, or we can take control of our data and think about returning to some of those classical small sample parts where we get survey analysis, thick description, and partner them up. So I don't have a great answer for what the specific indicators would be, except for that I totally agree that we need a good one for social relationships. It just is so important. But I think, if I was trying to train a young grad student about this, I would say exactly that you need to be controlling the data on this. So finding ways in which you can get a small sample, study its change over time, get rich detail on it is going to be really important.
Jimmy, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, this is a small follow-up question on what Jamie was just saying is, I guess the question would be, at what levels should we be clustering if we were going to design those sorts of kind of data collection efforts, right? In my world, a traditional one is schools, but like that's not the right one if we want to talk later life course, like Sean was talking, so like how might those best be kind of optimized if we had the infinite, proverbial infinite resources?
Jimmy, I don't know. I don't have a great answer for that. But I think that as we're thinking about those, the ways in which we would find the natural borders of how health lifestyles cluster, so we could think about the geographical unit that people have access to, or also going deep within the health lifestyle and thinking about the cross-cutting parts that are associated with, so the cross cohort, the cross demographic analysis of that. I don't know what the limits of those would be. I don't think I have a good answer for that, but maybe other folks do.
I was hoping to hear what Sean wanted.
What people have been saying, I absolutely agree with. I think the limits Pat was pointing out are definitely probably one of the main drivers of what we've been looking at. And then, what Jamie was saying, just broaden data collection strategies, even though they'll be small, and there's certainly room for that. I guess one minor thing I would add that I encountered recently is I do think that there are some things, like sleep in particular, is asked on a lot of surveys, but has not made it into, this group. And the thing that I encountered, I actually had this in a grant recently, and the reviewers felt that it shouldn't be included. And they argued, in my case, this was looking at older adults, that sleep was more of a health outcome than it was a health behavior. right? And so this gets back to what we need are just clear sort of theoretical guidelines to push these things. And I don't know what those are yet. I don't think we have a real obvious way to develop, like a way to say, like, this is a health behavior, this is a health outcome. Under this context, we can think of it this way. But until we've got that, I think we're vulnerable to these arguments, except for the really obvious, big four or so health behaviors.
Yeah, what is a health behavior? I mean, and I know that in like all of my papers, I think every time a reviewer wants to know how we're defining or like bounding health behaviors, and we kind of come up with an idea that we use, but it's not necessarily something that we want to be universal, right? And because I feel like a lot of that distinction between behavior and outcome is cultural almost. There's a lot of talk about obesity as a behavior outcome, but people are never like, oh, smoking, that's a choice, that's a behavior, that's something you have agency over. But a lot of smokers have mental health issues that it helps with, right? Like it's not. I find the distinction to be fuzzier than even than I don't know than even we might think. I don't even when we're saying it's fuzzy.
I mean, just to be fair, it's not hard to go through sociology journals and find obesity used as a health behavior.
Yeah, well, I've done that, even though I disagree with it kinda. Sometimes it's helpful to put it in the category that you're looking at, right?
So following up on some of those parts, I think one area that I think is somewhat promising that we can do, and maybe there's debate about whether this actually needs to be included as a health lifestyle, maybe not, but as a better predictor of it, are thinking about these kind of health perception questions and thinking about the role that they have. So specifically, we just started talking about obesity, and this is what triggered this thought. If doing work on people perceiving their weight and then thinking about the actions they're taking with that, I think are really helpful ways of doing that. So if we're asking a question about sleep and then asking people's intention about that sleep and tracking those over time, it does help. Those are variables that are available in a lot of our data sets and can lend some context to some of those health behaviors where we face some ambiguity. So is it an outcome? Is it a predictor? Well, let's add some intentionality onto that. And if we do that, it might solve, I don't, will we ever satisfy the reviewers about that? But it can give you some ammo for saying, well, the reason we're using these like this is because we have direct measures of perception where people are at least perceiving these in this way, or at least having some intentionality of doing that. So if we can add not just those lifestyle questions, but perception of that lifestyle, and crucially, examine a situation in which weight stays constant over a 20-year period, but perception totally changes over that time, where, as Patrick was mentioning, that weight perception that we think about at age 20 changing over time, even if something stays constant, if the perception changes over it, you may be able to measure a change in lifestyle approach, even if some measure stayed constant, or it gives you some more flexibility of doing that. So I think adding in some perception measures may open the door to getting some more nuanced thoughts about lifestyle research.
Yeah, I can see that. And so AdHealth does have some perception questions, and I know Ilya Guten, he might be in the other panel, has looked at that some. And I think the problem is that everybody is like, oh, I weigh too much, I'm trying to lose a little weight. Like that's everybody all the time. Like there isn't as much variation in the perceptions, or maybe we're just not capturing the perceptions well enough, like with those simple questions.
Right, there's the driver's license problem with that. Whenever asked, we always knock a few off and we kind of have the same perceptions. I will say that looking at the NLSY 97, looking at that over time, I have seen that there's variation in the weight perception questions across groups. Particularly if you look at Black women compared to Hispanic women and white women, there's some pretty substantial differences in perception of weight at those different areas. But then we're, now again, we're following into the granularity, we can get out. So yes, and maybe we could ask a couple more about that. That might be an easy add-on to a survey. Also something that you could do at an age 40, age 50 health module that would be a light add-on to existing data sets that may actually be feasible if we're trying to produce new data. Like we might actually be able to earn funding for that and do that versus having to build some of these really complex data sets.
Yeah, so I'm mindful of the time, but since I'm moderator, I wanted to make another point, which is that I struggle with the intentionality and agency part of things, and this is something that's also been a struggle in papers and responding to reviewers in terms of like how much, it's like, well, people don't have any control over this, but then they do have control over that, and I think it's all agencies structured together, and we can never really know the level of intentionality and level of agency. Like we just don't have a good way of measuring that. I don't know if anybody, maybe we can come back to this. I have a feeling agency is going to come up in the final session. So, okay, so I'll conclude there. Thank you so much to the panelists and to the attendees. And we'll take a break and see you for the final panel. Thanks so much.